Welcome to the Story a Day podcast. This is Julie Duffy, encouraging you to be a writer today, not someday. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. This is Julie from the storyaday.org podcast, recording another episode for you. This time, as I record, it is November, and many of you, I'm quite sure, are deep in the process of struggling with your NaNoWriMo commitment and your NaNoWriMo novel. Now, short story writers, don't tune out, because what I'm going to talk about today also applies to you as you develop your stories. But I do want to take a little moment here just to think about a few things that are going to help you. As somebody who has been encouraging people for 10 years to get involved in 30-day challenges or 31-day challenges in the case of Story a Day May, I have a few tips. I've done this a few times. I understand the rhythms of the challenge, and I understand when it gets hard and why it gets hard and what you can do about it. So I've got a couple of things to talk to you about today. One is, first I want to talk to you about the mental game and why it's so hard right now in the middle of the month. And secondly, I want to talk about the practical craft-based reasons why it's so hard right here in the middle of the story. The wonderful thing about month-long challenges is they're finite, but the downside is that the difficult part comes at you from both sides. So, let's talk about what's going on inside your head. When you woke up on the first day of NaNoWriMo or the Story a Day or whatever challenge, I bet you were super excited. Today's the day I get to start my story. And the possibilities were endless, limitless, and everything you were doing was exciting and new. But before that, if I can take you back a few days or a few weeks before that point where you started writing, there was something that made you sign up for this challenge. And I want you to close your eyes right now and just breathe and put yourself back in that moment. The moment that you pulled the trigger, that you said yes, that you signed up, that you said, I'm going to do this. There were reasons why you wanted to do it. And I'm not even going to ask you to think about those. I'm going to ask you to think about how it felt. And I know you can do this because you're a writer. You can go back to that moment and you can put yourself in that moment, and you can close your eyes and just feel what you felt. There was excitement. There was a little bit of dread, a little bit of adrenaline, a little bit of, am I really going to do this? And there was probably a fair sense of peer pressure. Somebody you know has done this, and they've got to the end of the month and they've come out with the challenge accomplished, and they've been giddy and excited, and you wanted some of that. So put yourself back in that moment a week, 2 weeks before the challenge started. What did you want? I bet you were picturing yourself at the end of the challenge with a completed novel, or with 50,000 words, or with 31 stories. And how did you feel about yourself, about that winner? It's pretty compelling. So just take a moment to picture yourself there again, because we're in the middle of the challenge. The novelty has worn off. You're probably tired. You're working hard on this every day, as well as doing all of the other things that you have to do in your life. And there's a strong temptation to quit, because it's hard. It genuinely is hard just to get to the desk. And it's hard for story reasons as well, which I'll talk about. But it's hard to get to your desk. So put yourself back in that moment where you were excited and you could see yourself at the finish line. Think about it in present tense. I'm sitting at my desk and I'm typing the last words. And the word count ticker has just ticked over. And I've got 50,000 words and 50,041 words. And I'm approaching the end of my story. How do you feel? What can you feel? Is it keys under your fingers? Do you have a pen in your hand? Where are you sitting? What can you smell? Are you in a coffee shop? Can you smell the coffee? Can you hear people talking? Can you hear the hum of your heating if you're at home? Have you just eaten a celebratory cookie or a celebratory carrot? Are you fiercely pounding coffee, or are you downing warm lemon water to help you get through? Put yourself back in that moment and really think about it. Write about it if you have to. Get yourself excited again until you're kind of like jiggling in your seat. And if you need to stop this recording and go and do that right now, do that. Let me assure you, professional writers do not write perfect first drafts. I've seen first drafts of books that went on to become polished novels. They are not perfect. They wander. They're a bit boring in places. They're repetitive. They're overdone. They skip bits. Professional authors don't write good first drafts, and neither should you. It's tempting at the middle of the month, when you've put in all of this effort, to look at what you've done as you're floundering around in the middle of the story and say, I have spent so much time and energy on this, it should be better. But it shouldn't. Professional authors get to the end of their stories. That's what the first draft is all about. It's about figuring it out. It's about getting to the end of the story. And they do it because they have contracts. They have an editor waiting for them. They freak out just as much as you do. But they have an editor waiting for the book, so they finish. What these challenges are replicating for the rest of us is that deadline, that need to get to the end of the story, because it's the only thing that will help you push through the difficult bit. It's difficult to do what we're doing. If you send your proposal or your query off to an agent and you've never finished a draft, well, that's a terrible idea in the first place, because agents want to see finished novels. But if you've only ever finished one draft and you send your novel off to the agent and they say, great, and they get you a 2-book deal, and all of a sudden you've got to get another book written, and you've never done that before, never written a book on a deadline, that's not a recipe for a happy life. This, what you're doing right now, is practice. It's practice for the act of getting to the end of the story, writing a first draft, getting it done, so that if you decide to take this forward into a career, and if you're good and lucky and you work hard, you're going to have that knowledge in the back of your head that says, I've done this before, I can do it again. And every published author that I've ever talked to has more or less said, I get through it because I know I've done it before. This is practice for you. Don't give up. Get to the end of the draft. You can absolutely do this, but you might need to spend some time every day picturing what it's going to look like at the end. And don't picture yourself bedraggled and splayed out over your desk. There might be some of that, but picture the moment after that when you leap up and go, I did it. I made a commitment, and I wrote this whole story and these 50,000 words and these 31 stories and whatever it is you're doing, and I did it. And if you haven't done it before, ask someone you know who has, and they will tell you it always feels that good. No matter how you felt in the middle, it's always worth it. So that's my mindset part of the class today. The second thing I want to talk about is also important, and it hits at the same time as the difficulty of being in the middle of the challenge. The middle of the story is hard. And there are technical reasons why the middle of the story is hard. You've spent all this time opening up possibilities. You've been sending your characters into situations, and it's all open-ended. We haven't really started closing anything yet. You may have closed down some possibilities. Maybe they've discovered some things that have closed some pathways, but there are a lot of pathways still open to your characters and to you as their puppet master. And somewhere around about the middle, you have to start making choices. And it's also the middle of the challenge month. So you're tired. And when you're tired and you're sort of depleted mentally, decisions are hard. So just acknowledge that and say, I'm going to make one decision for my characters today. And start thinking about how you're going to close off the pathways for them. They can't do everything. So think about it as narrowing them down through a funnel. You're going to close off all of the things that they could do, and you're going to put them on the path to the climax and resolution that's important for the lessons that they need to learn for their internal journey. If you need some more technical thoughts on this, I'm going to put a link to some Writing Excuses podcast episodes in the notes, because I know they talk about this stuff really well. I'm also going to point you towards James Scott Bell, who's a great writing teacher, who he talks about a moment, and I'll put a link to his book in the notes as well, but he talks about this moment in the middle of a story where there is a mirror moment. Because when you get to the midpoint of a story, especially a traditional narrative like a novel, unless you're writing experimental fiction, then you can ignore me, but there's a moment in the middle of a traditional story, Western story structure, where the character has to sort of come to face with themselves and make a change. Everything changes, right? And there's a midpoint of the story, everything changes. And it's quite often a literal mirror moment. They either see themselves in a mirror and think, what have I become? Because they've probably been failing for a while now, and they need to start turning things around and reassembling the team, or gathering themselves up for the push to the climax. Or they see themselves in a reflection of a shop window and they see themselves all bedraggled. Or they meet someone who reflects back at them what they could be if they took that one more step down the bad path. It could be the antagonist, it could be the villain of the piece. That's a really interesting way to do it, to have your villain be almost what your main character is, but they took that step down the wrong path. So have that. So if you're stuck in your story and you haven't got to the middle yet, consider writing that mirror moment today, whether it is your character looking in the mirror and going, what have I done? Who have I become? Or whether it's them just catching sight of themselves in a shop window, or whether it's having another character reflect back at them what they could be. And that's your midpoint. And then at the end of this week, you've only got 2 weeks left in this challenge. So at the end of this week, just start writing from there. Don't worry about the stuff you haven't done in the first half of the book yet. Write your mirror moment sometime by like the 15th, or actually here we are. So write it today. And then start for the next 2 weeks pushing towards the consequences of that conversation that they have with themselves, or that realization they've come to. I also recommend, if you're stuck if you feel like you're wandering around in the middle of nowhere and your story is just going nowhere, I recommend having a look at the Save the Cat series of books, especially Save the Cat writes a novel. The thing I found the most, that's by Jessica Brody, the thing I found most helpful about that book was that it didn't talk about rising action and midpoints and inciting incidents so much as it talked about, here's what the first part of your book is supposed to achieve. Here's what the second quarter of your book is supposed to achieve. And here's the third part is the fun and games where they're running around and trying stuff. And the fourth part is, and she talks you, and it comes from Blake Snyder's Save the Cat model, but it talks you through not so much what you're trying to do, but what you're trying to achieve and how you're trying to make the reader feel. And I found that really, really useful. So as you push on towards the end of your book, if you're not someone who's big on story structure, I would still take a look at that book, Save the Cat Writes a Novel, to help you think about the purpose of the next 25,000 words that you want to write and the shape of them. Think of it as a long short story or 2 long short stories. The other thing that causes people to wander around a little bit is they lose sight of their character's motivation. And I know you've heard me talk about Lisa Cron's book, Story Genius, before. She talks about how the childhood damage of your character shapes their internal journey and their behaviours that they've carried into their adulthood, which are problematic for them at this point. Because childish behaviours serve you as a child, don't serve you as an adult. And that's probably part of what your character is going through. And you might be worried about, plot and what happens in this story, but you're never going to figure that stuff out unless you know why your character's acting the way they are. So some other resources, if that kind of makes you think, ooh, and I know I just skipped over it really quickly, but if that makes you think, ooh, I'm not dealing with my character's inner journey, I'm just having her do stuff or having him do stuff. I have some resources for you that I'm going to put in the show notes. One is a document that went to the organisation that puts together the DSM thingy-bob that psychologists, DSMV-5, I think it was, the thing that the psychologists use to, sorry, this is not my field of expertise. Anyway, there's a paper that a bunch of people put together to propose that detrimental trauma disorder be a recognised diagnosis. And there's a lot of, so I'll link you to that paper, because in that paper they talk about the things that affect us in early childhood and the likely outcomes of that, and the behaviours that present themselves later in life based on the events that the child experienced, if they experienced some trauma. There's a growing discussion in psychology circles about adverse childhood events and how they affect success at school, success in adulthood, and it's not just being exposed to violence, but there's a whole adverse childhood events scorecard where they talk about, and I encourage you to Google some of this, and I'll put some links in, but they talk about, like a scale of, if your score on this adverse childhood events scorecard is higher, then these are the outcomes you're likely to see in adulthood. This kind of stuff is really, really useful for writers to get beneath the surface of our characters. Your character could be the most normal, middle-aged white housewife, and you think, well, she's wealthy and she hasn't got any problems, so how am I going to make things problematic? So I probably have to traumatize her now. No, you go back to her childhood and maybe her dad wasn't there or was mean to her, or maybe she was picked on at school, or maybe the family didn't have enough money for food growing up, so she has behaviours and expectations and insecurities that grow out of that, which she has totally eliminated the symptoms, because now she's a wealthy, middle-class, successful woman, but that trauma is still under the surface. So if you're having problems figuring out why your character's doing stuff or what her inner journey is, strongly suggest you look into some of these psychological treatises and just try and figure out what is it about your character that is making them struggle and not do the right thing. Because there's nothing more annoying than when you're reading a book or watching a film and the problems could all be solved if somebody just talked to somebody else. And those books and films where they never explain why that person won't talk to the second party, you're like, just go and tell them the truth. You can still get away with that kind of plot line in a book, but you have to explain it. Your character has to have deep-seated reasons for not wanting to talk to that other person. There's also new research coming out about our primal approach to life, how we're wired inside, whether we see the world as good or bad, whether we see the world as progressing or regressing, and all kinds of things that predicts for behaviour. I've just started reading about this stuff now, so I don't know enough to explain it to you, but if you're interested in psychology, there's some new research on this thing called primals. which I recommend you go and have a look at. Maybe we'll get someone on to talk to you about it on this podcast. So, 2 things. Get yourself excited again. Remember where you were going, why you wanted to do this challenge. And I don't just mean remember it, I mean get right back into that moment. Close your eyes, take 5 minutes, journal about it in the present tense. I am finishing my novel. I am finishing this challenge. I feel this. I smell this. I remember this. Everything, sensory stuff, the stuff you're doing for your novel or your story. And the second thing, I gave you some technical craft-based insight into why it's difficult to write this midpoint, and hopefully some resources to figure out how you can leap over the difficulties that you might be having. If you're not having any difficulties, more power to you. Just keep your energy up, drink lots of water, get some sleep, get some exercise. You've got this. It's been great to be with you. I love the thought that so many people are just sitting down and doing the thing. You have a right to write. You have a right to write. It's not selfish. It's not trivial. It's who you are. And I'm so glad that you're taking this time to give yourself the gift of doing something that makes you feel good. Because on the whole, I mean, there are difficult moments, but on the whole, it makes you feel good, right? That's why we do it. And we're connecting with people. That's the other thing I would say. The only other advice that I haven't given on this podcast is get together with some people. If you're in the Story A Day Superstars, hop onto the Slack channel. We'll arrange some write-ins in the next couple of weeks. If you're not in the Superstars, the NaNoWriMo site has lots of opportunities for you to connect with people. Even if you're shy, ask someone how you can help them, and you will find friends. We can't do this alone. I don't know anyone who does this alone. And it's hard to get your head around that at first, but connections will keep you accountable. Connections will give you strength. People will lift you up on the days when you're having a hard time. So keep writing, keep connecting, keep reaching out, and come to the blog and tell me what your secrets for success in the midpoint of a challenge or the midpoint of a story are. And most of all, keep writing. Thanks for listening. Why not come over to the blog at storyaday.org and check out this week's writing prompts and articles. And in the meantime, have a great creative week. And of course, keep writing.